Okay, it's time to get started. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CITIC Bookstore at the Genesis Beijing. Tonight, here we are going to have the Global Thinkers series of lectures of this year. We are honored to have Professor Roger T. Ames from Peking University to be the keynote speaker. And we are privileged to have two other distinguished professors, also from Peking University, Professor Martin Powers from the School of Arts, and Professor Chen Lesong from the Department of Philosophy to be the commentator. So please join me to warmly welcome Professor Roger T. Ames to start his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. What I wanted to do today is to have a very philosophical discussion, but also a very personal discussion. And so I begin my talk from a picture. And this picture is an image that in my generation, these were the people who were responsible for introducing China into the Western Academy. What the West knows about China in very important degree is dependent upon the hard work of these scholars. This is a man named Huang Junjie. He was the head of arts and humanities at Taida. This is Liu Dianjue. Liu Dianjue was my 指导老师. My Dao De Jing, I translated Dao De Jing for Random House. My Dao De Jing has sold 40,000 copies. 4万册. Not bad. DC Lao, 3万册. 300万册. He published with Qi with Penguin Publishing House. So his Dao De Jing has sold 3 million copies. 40,000 copies, 3 million copies. This man is Chen Rongjie, Wings at Chan. Very, very famous. He's the person who did the source book in Chinese philosophy that introduced Chinese philosophy into the English-speaking world. These are giants. This man here is Di Bai Rui, is Ted DeBerry, Columbia Daxue, the dean of Chinese studies at Columbia. And it goes on. This woman here is Qin Jiayi, Julia Qing, University of Toronto. This person here, you probably know, Du Weiming. This person here, Ge Han, Angus Graham. This person here, Don Monroe, Michigan University, University of Michigan. And this very handsome young man was me. Yeah. And this is Liu Xuxian. Liu Xuxian. And this is Kanaya Osumu from Japan, from Tohoku, and so on. These people were my generation of scholars who took responsibility for trying to understand Chinese culture and to try to communicate it to a Western audience. I love these guys. So these are the names of the people that I've got there. Jinggu Zhi. And so this is DC Lao, Liu Dianjue, and Ge Han. They were my teachers at the University of London. And with DC Lao, in his lifetime, he learned languages. He learned Japanese and German and Latin and Greek. And together, he and I, when we were in London, we went and we learned Pali. We studied Pali language. That he was so interested in all of these different languages, and it had nothing to do with going to Rome and being a very sophisticated person. He learned languages because he understood that sedimented into languages is culture. That language is a book that you open up and you understand a culture by learning the language. And so when I would visit him, he was the kind of professor that we all should want to be. That I did my PhD with him, and that was wonderful. And I finished at London, he went to Hong Kong, but for years after, in Hong Kong, every summer I would go to Hong Kong and we would read Huainanzi together and translate it, Sun Bin Bing Fa. We translated together and published these books. So he was a teacher, he was a student's teacher. He taught me, that if you're going to be a professor, then you have to understand what the obligation, what the responsibility of a good professor is. And then Ge Han, he was a typical idiosyncratic Englishman. He was a linguist, and he understood, like Saussure is a structuralist. And so his distinction between langue and parole is very much a structuralist kind of a distinction, but Graham used this in a different way. For him, langue was the fact that every culture has its own conceptual structure. That you can't say Tian in German. You can't say Dao in Spanish. That each culture has its own conceptual structure, and that we have to respect this. We have to allow other cultures to have their identity. But we have parole. We have the power of natural languages to say anything that we want. We can speak German, and we can explain what Chinese mean by Tian. We can speak Chinese, and we can understand clearly what Abrahamic religions mean by a transcendent God. That natural languages can say anything that we want them to say, that natural languages are powerful. And so we don't have incommensurability. We can communicate between cultures through natural languages, even though our conceptual structures are very different. And the conceptual structure of the Chinese tradition is particularly different. Now, Graham spent his long career studying China and trying to make the argument that this world called China is really very different from the kind of philosophical tradition that has its roots in ancient Greece. That what he saw coming out of ancient Greece is a substance language, is an ontological language, is a language that is categorical, a language that wants to define everything and wants to teach us what is what. It's a language that posits a reality behind appearance, where knowledge is to grasp that reality. I get it, I comprehend it, I grasp it, is the language of Europe, is the European languages derived from classical Greece in terms of the way in which we think about knowing. And so in English, do you know it? You either know it or you don't know it. That's very strange. Like, do we know each other? maybe. But over time, we really get to know each other. And in a lifetime, we get to know each other. That knowing is an event. It's not a thing. It's not either or. But that kind of reality appearance distinction in classical Greece turned the idea of knowing into a very strange idea. Now, I want to focus on a few things here. Graham is very explicit about the philosophical differences between ancient Greece and classical China. And so he says, in the Chinese cosmos, all things are interdependent without transcendent principles by which to explain them or a transcendent origin from which they derive. Strict transcendence means independent. A transcendent God is a God that is independent of the world. That the idea of Aryuan Lun, the idea of dualism, is grounded in the notion of transcendence. If you have transcendence, you have dualism. If you have transcendence, you have dualism. So that the Chinese cosmos, all things are interdependent, are 互相依靠的, and so you take an idea like Tian, you take an idea like Tao, and Western people reading these ideas, immediately coming out of the Greek tradition, are going to assign them a kind of transcendent status. But in Chinese, 天人合一. In Chinese, 人能弘道. In Chinese, 道行之而成. That Tao is made in the walking. 本立而道生. Tao is something that's alive, that is growing. It's not something that is fixed and unchanging. And so Graham wanted us to understand that these are two very importantly different worlds, and that we have to struggle with imagination to understand the difference. If we can understand the difference, then we can have a conversation. Then we can philosophize between these two antique traditions. So, two more of our great scholars, Marcel Grenet and Joseph Needham, made an argument in the 1930s, in the 1940s, 1950s, that if we're going to try to understand Chinese texts, we have to read them in terms of an interpretive context. We have to allow them to reside within their own tradition and understand the questions that they are addressing, understand the historical, the intellectual, the natural conditions that obtained in order to understand these texts. And so this idea of interpretive context, 传世已经, 揭示语经, 传世语经, an interpretive context. And so Needham, really relying very heavily upon Grenet, says social and world order rested not on an ideal of authority, not on a concept of God, but on a conception of rotational responsibility. Tao was the all-inclusive name for this order, an efficacious sum total, a reactive neural medium, neural existential, neural cognitive, neural in terms of perception, that the idea of the brain is neurology. And so the idea that this is a living world, this isn't simply a material world, this world is vital, this world is alive. This thing called Tao is a living, existential idea. It was not a creator, for nothing is created in the world, and the world was not created. What do you think about that? That the world was not created, and nothing in the world is created. Can we understand Tao in that way? I think so. I'm going to try to persuade you that what Needham is saying is the way that we should understand this. Chinese ideals involve neither God nor law. And so this is Grenet, and this wonderful old man is Joseph Needham. This Le Pente Chinoise, I edit a series of books for State University of New York Press, and I'm glad to say that at last, next year, a very good English translation of this book will be available, and then we can translate it into Chinese. You know that, and also his Civilisation is translated. With Joseph Needham, you already have translations, but Needham continues. The uncreated universal organism, whose every part, by a compulsion internal to itself and arising out of its own nature, willingly performed its functions in the cyclical recurrences of the whole. Thus the mechanical and the quantitative, the forced and the externally imposed, were all absent. The notion of order excluded the notion of law. What he's talking about is he's talking about 自然而然, you know, that this world unfolds according to itself without appeal to something outside. There's no Plato's realm of forms. There's no concept of a creator God. That the Chinese world, this classical world that is made explicit, the cosmology that is made explicit in the I Ching Da Zhuan, that this world is a world that is autogenerative, autopoietic. It doesn't rely upon something outside in order to create it. And then finally, what Needham says is that the key word in Chinese thought is order, and above all pattern, li. Li Xing de li is this idea of pattern. And if I may whisper it, 悄悄地说, if I may whisper it for the first time, organism. 有几体, the idea of organism, you know. The symbolic correlations or correspondences all form part of one colossal pattern. If they did not behave in those particular ways, they would lose their relational position in the whole, which made them what they were, and turn into something other than themselves. They were thus parts in the existential dependence upon the whole world organism. This is not easy stuff. This is very philosophical. And up until now, it has either been misunderstood or ignored. That what he is saying is what I'm going to try to unfold. Like what I take as my job is not to be original, not to invent my own interpretation of China, but to try to say more clearly what these people have tried to say. That there is this tradition that begins with Marcel Grenet, Jiang Guangzhi, Fritz Mote, Angus Graham, Tang Juni, Fei Xiaotong, and so on. These people had an understanding of the basic differences between these worlds, and we haven't understood them sufficiently well. So I'm going to try to say something about that. Now, what I did is I introduced a new idea called zoetological thinking. You have ontological thinking, 本体论思维, and that has a certain a mission. Ontological thinking wants to put things into categories and understand things categorically. It wants to tell us what is what, this and not that. And so the kind of logic, Aristotelian logic that we have, is all about truth tables, is all about identifying, all about getting clear on the things that we know. But zoetological thinking is really very different. Think of the I Ching, 生生之为义, that the change itself is all about 生生. 天地之大德曰生, that the greatest capacity of the cosmos is life. 生生不息, 生生不息. That the idea of life. So in classical Greek tradition, the starting point, the first philosophy, 第一哲学, is being. We start from being. You're a human being. And you're a human being too, because both of you have some self-same identical characteristic that defines your humanity. That's classical Greek thinking. In the Chinese tradition, Ren is something that you achieve. You're not an individual when you're born. When you're born, 你什么都不是. You're nothing. And then you cultivate your relationships with other people, and gradually you emerge in your family, in the community, to become somebody that is distinctive, somebody that everybody knows your name, somebody other people respect. And so a human in this classical Chinese tradition is an accomplishment. You're not born a human being, it's something that you do, something that you accomplish. And so instead of calling it human beings, we should call it human becomings. 成人之道, 不是做人之道. You know, that human is something that we do, and that we do together, or we don't do at all. You can't be Ren by yourself. You need other people in order to become Ren. And so this zoetological thinking, 生生不之为义, gives us a world without some kind of antecedent cause. There is no substratum. There is no antecedent origin of the world. The world is Ziran, our Ran, Dao Fa Ziran. That if we translate Dao Fa Ziran into English, maybe we can say that the world is self-sowingly so. The world is self-sowingly so. The world is so of its own accord. It's autogenerative, that it emerges of its own accord. It doesn't rely upon something outside of it in order to become what it is. And so when Needham talks about Tao as the universal, uncreated organism, how do we understand that when we understand Tao as the source? On the one hand, it's uncreated, but on the other hand, it's a source. And so to put these two things together, what we have to do is we have to understand that there's two very different ways of thinking about creativity. One way of thinking about creativity is creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. How do you say? 无中生有. That creatio ex nihilo. And that's very familiar in Western cosmology, the idea of creatio ex nihilo. God creates the world out of nothing. But in this In this Chinese cosmology, you have situated, you have a kind of situated creativity. That creativity is something that happens in our relationships. That creativity is not something that where you create out of nothing. Creativity is growth in relationships. In the Confucian tradition, what is morality? Morality is not doing what God tells you to do, because there's no God. Morality is behaving in your relationships with other people in such a way that you strengthen, that you expand upon the quality of the relationship you have with other people. To be immoral is to do the opposite, is to be disintegrative, to diminish relationships. And so morality, 生生论, morality is all about growth. Why is education so important in this tradition? Growth. What is beauty in this tradition? Growth. What is religiousness in this tradition? Growth. So the idea of 生生论 is really fundamental, and it gives us an alternative understanding of creativity itself. Now, creativity, the influence of religion on our culture, particularly the Western philosophical narrative, is really profound. That when we think of Western culture, we think of individualism, we think of entrepreneurship, we think of science and technology and so on. But the word creativity has been so affected by our religious sensibilities that we can't use it in ordinary language. If I were to say that my good friend Marty is morally creative, he would feel very bad. And Kathy would feel really bad. You know, that we don't talk about morality in terms of creativity. The Pope is not creative. We don't talk about, if somebody says that she is economically creative, it means she's stealing your money. If we say that somebody is religiously creative, it means a new religion. You know, religion is conservative, not creative. You know, if you know that the word creativity is used for art, it's used for fiction, but it's not used for the main things that human beings do: religion, morality, science, economy. We don't use the word creative because it is so affected by the idea that creativity belongs to God, that God is a creator God, and that human beings, we do use, when the human being becomes creative in that way, then you become Faust. Then you becomes Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Then you become Milton's Satan. Then you become Nietzsche's Übermensch. That this is a human being acting in a way that belongs to God. And it's very exciting, but it's very morally suspect. It's something that is not accepted as as the kind of creativity that we see with the concept of God. And now, so when we think about the translation of the Chinese tradition into Western culture, we have to recognize the profundity of the influence of religion on how we've come to understand it. The powerful. And so there's a scholar named Ames who wrote a book called The Birth of Orientalism, and he makes the claim, and I believe this claim, Marty would be the person who would give us the best answer here, but it sounds right to me, and that is that Most Europeans at the beginning of the 19th century, with unwavering certainty, believed that the cosmos was only a few thousand years old. God created the cosmos. That all life on earth, including humanity, was descended from Noah's Ark. That Christianity is the only true and consummate religion from which all other religions are derived. That human faith and piety continue to play a pivotal role in the larger cosmic order and its divine history. That the unreason of madness, that madness itself, was a freely chosen moral error. And that each one of us has an immortal soul that, at the risk of irrevocable damnation, will one day stand before God in judgment for our deeds done. That this is 200 years ago, where human beings largely, Europeans largely, saw the world in these terms. The cosmos is only a few hundred years old. That each one of us will stand before God and be judged. So when the Christian missionaries came to China, what they wanted to do is they wanted to win the soul of China. And so what they wanted to do was to close the gap between these two very different worlds. And so in order to close the gap, they took Chinese terms. They take a term like Tian and translate it with a capital H, heaven. Right away, anybody who speaks English is going to read heaven as a metonym for a transcendent concept of God. They translate Li as ritual. Ritual is the church. They translate Yi, Ren Yi de Yi, as righteousness. Righteousness is not an ordinary English word. We don't use the word righteousness. Righteousness means 按照上帝要你做而做. To do the will of God is righteousness. And so we translate Ren as benevolence. Benevolence is the virtue of Jesus. And it's a very good virtue, but it's not Confucian. And then the term Dao, we translate as the way, 一个大写的一个 way. If we look at the Bible, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That the idea of virtue is the nature of God, that truth and beauty and goodness for the human being is derived from God, comes from a transcendent God. And so these terms are translated into something that belongs to the Christian tradition, but not to the Chinese tradition. But if we allow this tradition to speak on its own terms, Dao, this is Berggruen, that Dao is not his way, is not the way of God. Dao is the human way, that this is the human being. This is the shou, the head, with a head of hair, if we look at the Berggruen. When we look at De is the roadway and going straight ahead. 志, 一直走. And then this is the Jimwen. Then you have the human heart to make it explicit that this is a human idea, that Dao De doesn't come from God. It's something that is part of a human world. It doesn't exclude. You have the San Cai, the three. If we look at the I Ching is all about the human being developing those kinds of technologies, farming, boats, writing, all of these different kinds of technology that enable us to coordinate the human experience most effectively with the world in which we live. And so it's not that the human being excludes the natural world, the world beyond the human experience. It's that the human being has to coordinate the human experience with that world. And so Dao De is the human being living in the world in such a way that you have a flourishing cosmos. So simply put, Tao is not the way or his way, but the making of our way together, both ancestors and progeny and so on. So the notion of De is not virtue in the sense of some kind of a capacity that comes from an external source. De is De Dao De De, that De is comporting yourself with other people in such a way that you are achieving coalescence in your relationships with other people, that you're working together and you're strengthening the relationships so that we have a good family, so that we have a good community, so that we have a human society that is civilized and that works together in order to achieve the goals that we share, the values that we share. And so the idea of De is a kind of virtuosity. It's a human being virtuosic, not with a violin, but as a person, being virtuosic as a person. Now, what I wanted to do is just to take a couple of passages from the classics and try to show how the Christian way of thinking has really become our way of thinking about Chinese culture. And so if we take just one passage from the Tao Te Ching, Dao Shengzhi, De Xuzhi, Wu Xingzhi, Shi Chengzhi, Shi Yi Wan Wu, Mo Bu Cun, Dao Er Gui De. Okay? When we look at Li Ya Ge, the translations of James Legge are fundamental, are very important, that James Legge set the translations for the centuries that followed from him. And his vocabulary for translating the Chinese tradition came from a theologian who lived 100 years before Legge named Joseph Butler. Joseph Butler was a very important theologian, and so the language of benevolence, of righteousness, of ritual, and so on, of heaven, these came from Joseph Butler. And so when Legge translates this, he says, all things are produced by the Tao and nourished by its outflowing operations. They receive their forms according to the nature of each and are completed according to the circumstances of their condition. Therefore, all things without exception honor the Tao and exalt its outflowing operation. This honoring of the Tao and exalting of its operation is not the result of any ordination, a religious term. Ordination is to make somebody into a priest, is a religious act, but always a spontaneous tribute. Now, when you look at this, he has the suppressed premises of an Aristotelian causal ontology, the idea of capitalizing Tao is this kind of reverential language that we use in religious practices. But the most important problem that we find with his translation is the separation of creator and creature, is to make Tao into something that creates a world. So my own zoetological reading of the same chapter locates it in this organic world, in this ecological world, 生态性的一个有机性的一个概念。So my translation of the same passage would be The world-growing ecology, Tao, brings all things to life. And a symbiotic and coalescing virtuosity nourishes them. We nourish each other in our relationships with each other. Environing things shape them, and their contextualizing circumstances usher them to completion. It is thus that all things revere the world-growing ecology and venerate their symbiotic virtuosity. As for such reverence and veneration, it arises spontaneously, 自然, without anything decreeing it to be so. That the idea of Tao is not something that creates something else. Tao is an ecological sensibility. It's an organic sensibility. It's understanding that the world is alive and that everything in the world emerges out of this kind of ecology. And that ecology is what we call Tao. You have the whole, you have the Wanwu, but it's an ecological sensibility. And so Tao is not some equivalent of a transcendent conception of God or some static object of knowledge, as is suggested by the way, but modeling itself on the adverbial and thus modal self-sowingly so, Tao is a continuing, organic, and holistic process within which all things are integral and vital participants. When we think of Tao and Wanwu, Tao doesn't create Wanwu. Tao and Wanwu are two different ways of looking at the same phenomenon. We look at our human experience and it's continuous and it's consummating. That experience has a closure, that we have a lecture tonight and then the lecture is finished. You know, that experience has that kind of rhythm to it. And so, and the human experience, if we ever forget how mysterious, how extraordinary the human experience is, how extraordinary another person is, then we've ceased to live. That Tao is not mystical in the sense of lights flashing and funny feelings. Tao is mystical in the sense that the human experience is bottomless. It's wonderful. It's extraordinary to be a human being. And so Tao has that kind of meaning. And then the world is full of the Wanwu, of different things that we participate with, that we enjoy, that we develop relationships with. And so, so this idea of Tao as an ecological way of understanding the human experience. And so when we reflect on the term sheng, Dao Shengzhi, that is translated as bringing things to life, on the oracle bones, sheng is written as a plant breaking ground. But when we think of birth, if like in English, if you look at the word sheng, first term is birth, life, growth. What I want to suggest that is in the Chinese language, it should be life, growth, birth. That what you have in a Chinese cosmology is this idea of puxi, this idea of genealogy. You have xueshu puxi. Those are my colleagues, the people who I am a part of as a community, is a kind of academic, scholarly genealogy. But when we think of birthing, we think of a woman giving birth. That these two things seem to be very different. And yet, if we think ontologically, they are different. Because you have one human being, and when a woman gives birth to a child, then you have two human beings. And so one becomes two. When you have a plant breaking ground, that seems to be very different. And so to use the word birthing for a plant seems to be metaphorical, seems to be figurative, seems to be misplaced. But if we think in terms of zoetology, if we think in terms of genealogy, if we think in terms of a family tree, if we think in terms of a family tree, that human beings are not individual, that a human being looks like her grandmother, a human being gives birth to a child that looks like her, and the physicality of the human experience is what is most obvious, The values, the language, the food, the music, the culture that we pass on from generation to generation is this continuity. And so the idea of being born within a genealogy, within a family tree, is not so different from a plant breaking ground. You know, that we're individuals, we have our individuality, we're unique. Each one of us is unique. 和而不同. Each one of us is unique. But at the same time, we're also 异多不分. We're also the inseparability of one and many. So if we see the world that way, then the difference between plant growth and human reproduction is not so strange. So the idea of embodiment, the idea of 体现. You know, when you think, if you ask what is the story of China, the story of China is maybe 孝, is 孝道, is each generation passing on the culture to the generation that comes after it, where that generation has the responsibility of expanding upon it. If you ask, where did the Chinese language come from? 那个汉语是哪里来的？祭祀 It's the ancestral sacrifices. If we go to Anyang Windsor 博物馆, we can see 5,000 Berggruen characters. 5,000. To read a Chinese newspaper, 3,000. Literacy in China, 3,500 characters. And so 5,000 is already a very robust, a very extensive kind of a language. But the Hanzi, 那个字, means offspring, 后代. And so that 5,000 characters becomes 大汉和字典有5万个字. It has 50,000. So the 5,000 characters become 50,000 characters because of this proliferation, because the culture expands and expands in terms of the different things that human beings do within the culture. And so the idea of family, the idea of genealogy, the idea of embodiment from generation to generation is the story of China. Just got to watch my time. I'm going to jump ahead here because I want to get back to my picture. That when I talk about a genealogy, I want to demystify that. I don't want to just leave it as a kind of abstract idea. That this is a genealogy, and here you have a 小树苗. You have the sprout of a sinologist. But then, this man here, Chen Longjie, he was the first chairman of my philosophy department at the University of Hawaii. He was the first chairman in the 1930s. And then you had the war, and because they closed the university down, he left Hawaii and he went to Dartmouth and became the professor there. But he was an extraordinary scholar. He was a scholar such that his source book in Chinese philosophy was the most important resource for introducing Chinese philosophy into the English-speaking world. And of course, it has a Chinese translation. The limitations of he sort of set the boundaries. And then after him, people tried to achieve the same standard, the same quality of translation, but they used the same vocabulary. Dao is the way, Ren is benevolence, and so on. And so in this story, in this genealogy, that's the old me. And this is me at Beida with Cheng Lesong and Sun Cheng-chan and Wu Ganyo and the next generation, all of us working together to try to understand Chinese philosophy better as part of this kind of ecology, of growth, of trying to grow it into something that is profounder than what we received. And so in producing a new source book, I'm not disrespecting Chen Rongjie, I'm showing him respect. I'm taking what he gave us and trying to grow it, where the most important thing is this idea of a conceptual lexicon, to try to get past the old Christianized vocabulary and to understand the Confucian tradition on its own terms. Let it speak with its own voice, use its own terminology in order to express it. And so I'm just going to finish up very quickly, but I want to take one more term and show you how this is a real problem. If I show you one term, Dao, that's one term. But this idea of Ren, translating it as benevolence, is really a fundamental problem. And the problem is, Lesong, that it's not only Lao Wai who is using that vocabulary, but the best Chinese scholars in publishing in Western languages are using the same vocabulary. And what they do is they reinforce the idea that this is an approach. They know what Ren means, but for them, the English term for Ren is benevolence. And so we just write in benevolence. But what does benevolence mean? In the Bible, benevolence is the disposition to do good. God is benevolent. And even though the human being has original sin, God has his own son executed, crucified, in order to be generous to the human being, in order to be merciful to the human being, in order to show pity on the human being. And so the act of divine benevolence, the ultimate act, is the sacrifice of his son. For human benevolence, benevolence is to love your neighbor as yourself. The golden rule in the Abrahamic tradition is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But isn't there something wrong with that? You know, the idea, the assumption that the other person wants the same thing that I want, and so I'm going to do to her what I think is a good thing, that's presumptuous, you know? And so the idea of the parable in the Good Samaritan, the last thing that Jesus says is he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's not Confucian. Confucian is 中恕之道. A shu means I have to put myself in her position and I have to understand what she likes, and then I have to calculate what is the best way to achieve a relationship where she gets what she needs and I get what I need. And so this idea of 利他, of altruism, 人 is not 利他, 人 is 利我利他. It's strengthening the relationship so that we both benefit. It's the relationship that grows. And it doesn't have to do with mercy and pity. And it's not 相下, that 人 is what people do in an equal relationship as you try to be 人. It's not, you don't begin from the Word of God and then act according to the Word of God. And so translating a term like 人 into benevolence, benevolence is a very nice thing, you know. Jesus is explaining to a lawyer, you know, that in order to be a good person, you have to treat other people with kindness. You have to be good to other people. You have to be generous with other people. You have to be merciful with other people. But that's not 人. 人 is 基利而利他, 基大而大他. No, how does that go? Have I got it wrong? 基有利而利他, 基有大而大他. You know, is the idea of understanding that we're interdependent, and that if we're going to achieve, that if your neighbor does better, you do better. If your family, if a member of your family does better, you do better. It's a different kind of a moral sensibility. And so what we have to do is we have to concern ourselves that to allow this tradition to speak on its own terms. And as Wittgenstein insists, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And so it's only when we understand 人 as 人, and when we understand Tao is Tao, that we have allowed the tradition to speak on its own terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ames, for your rich and insightful lecture and a warm and touching lecture. So let's welcome Professor Chen Lesong to comment on the presentation.
It's extended.
Okay. Okay. Please. I should apologize. I have to sit down here to keep myself with the slides. And first of all, I want to thank Rogers for this insightful speech. And the things that I can learn from his speech are the following three things, I think. The first thing is that he gave a very in-depth philosophical reflection on the intercultural tension through a way of translation of interlingual context, which is largely through the several examples that he mentioned about the meaning of Tao and learn, and is somehow misleading translation in the history of the Western academia. And second, I think that this change of translation of the keywords of Chinese thought manifested the growth of academia across generation, which could be shaped a traditional characteristic of sinology, and which has set up a very tight linkage across generation. And thirdly, I can figure out Roger tried to make clear his personal professional career, And this professional career will give us a very clear understanding of development or accomplishment of a personality as a scholar, as a distinguished scholar. You should just keep self-cultivation through your academic work, and through this way, you will find that your spiritual growth could be manifested by what you have done and what you have written and what you have contributed to the whole academia. So actually, after Roger sent both of us a PPT several days ago, and I just read through it very carefully, and his PPT actually reminded me of my own experience, which has great impact on me, because in the last 10 years, I give a lesson in YCA, the Yanqing Academy in Peking University, which is focused on critical terms of Chinese thought. And my mother tongue is not English; it's my second language. And in the very first semester, when I tried to deliver my own understanding of the key terms of Chinese philosophy into foreign students, I found that it's totally mission impossible. I refer to the sinologist, and I refer to the very classical translation of original text of Chinese thought, and I found that it seems somehow misleading. And when I try to give a comprehensive explanation of what is exactly the meaning of these terms in the original Chinese intellectual context, I find it's totally too difficult for me to put it very clear way. So after several years, I find that Roger gives another course on Chinese philosophy. So I always told my students, if you get anything confusing, just return to Roger. He can give you a very clear and very detailed explanation of the tension between a Chinese scholar and a sinologist who use different language and who have different cultural circumstance. So I use this term, the title of my, I regard this as my reading report to my teacher, to my mentor of my academic work. So this is just a reading report, but not in any sense a comment or something. I use 格义双重翻译 dual translation and untranslatability to demonstrate that I try to give certain different perspective from a Chinese scholar who try to link up the Western philosophical academia and my own understanding of the intellectual history of my own culture. I will put it in a very Roger way. I highlight the keywords in the right. Obviously, I would say that cross-cultural context and their consequence should be understood at the following two levels. Firstly, we actually have, because of the geographical different, we have different life experience and social orders and values as mode of thinking. And then actually this difference could be manifested in a very systematic way, including language, symbols, artifactors, all the kind of things. And this largely I call it 属人的方式 human mode. To make it more clearly, to say that to what extent is the cross-cultural communication interlingual, which I try to say is that the oral and the written language expression systems composed of vocabulary, semantics, grammar, and syntax, as well as always act involving speech practice in daily life, are fundamental carriers of direct communication and interaction between different cultural groups. And speech certified written forms become the texts, and that can be repeatedly read and interpreted, which means that the translation focus on the textual material, and this textual material will be regarded as classics. And the other things that I want to make clear is that the encounter and the mutual understanding of culture has become a public and universal requirement only in a context of globalization. Because without this so-called globalization, then it seems that there is no such necessary requirement for mutual understanding in depth. We just observe each other from distance, but maybe we have a legendary description of other cultures. But if we must trade with each other in a very vivid social life, in the trade systems, we must have an in-depth explanation or interpretation of other cultural traditions. So to speak, I would say that I put the interlingual translation of Chinese tradition intellectual texts as an example. Maybe I can put it in the following 4 different perspectives. The first is how we understand the language, which means that the view of language determines the understanding and definition of the value of translation. Comparative linguistics has abundant discussion on the difference between Chinese and other languages. Different languages communities may have different understanding to the extent to which language can determine the boundary of a way of thinking and the expression of ideas. Especially if we put it in a very Chinese way, you'll find the limitation and boundary of expression in the oral way or in the textual way is very clear. And most of the ancient Chinese thought and thinkers stick to this belief to say there is a clear boundary of what we can express through our writing or our speech. And if we just understand or regard if actually the ancient Chinese thinkers maybe has a strong sense of a boundary of possibility of language and speech expressions. So if we could regard translation as transforming, maybe Chinese ancient sages could be regarded as hermits who actually transfer the so-called a heavenly Tao to the humanly regulation or humanly order, from Tian Dao to Ren Run. At the same time, the detachment from specific context in the process of from practice to text and from action to dialogue constitute a second transformation in which language forms unique limitations. And in another way, you can find that in China there is a very strong tradition of interpretative way or interpretative tradition of the classical text. Seems that to go back to or returning to the classics and understand the teaching of the sage seems to be the basic method or the core expression strategy of the Chinese thought. So to speak, I would say that if we put this aside and we take a different way, we'll say that the translation is extremely important in public space of interlingual communication. Because what? Because the following 2 things. On the one hand, we can perceive the commonality of human experience in understanding and feeling all this kind of things. And on the other hand, we can
see the possibility of constructing orders in rich daily experience and the difference in worldviews brought about by the construction process, which means we can find something common, and we can understand why there is difference. And the second way is that as far as I can see, as a contemporary Chinese scholars who use Mandarin as a working language for the most of academic works, I see that Mandarin is a very strange language in between the Western language and traditional Chinese, you know. And I have a very very brute or very tentative conclusion to say that the Mandarin, I would say that it's a semantic distance from the Western language, which have shaped in modern vocabulary system and knowledge structure, is smaller than that from classic Chinese, which means that we actually should be very clearly aware of the distance between Mandarin and traditional Chinese. And this means that we must have the dual translation. When we say we try to introduce Chinese classical texts into Westerner, because firstly, we must translate into Mandarin, and through Mandarin, we translate into a Western language. But the thing is very interesting. The very sources of the Mandarin vocabulary and the idea and also the reasoning structures come from the translation from the Western language in the modern China. And you know, the pooling of the knowledge, methodology, and theories from the Western shaped the mindset of the Chinese scholars. And nowadays, my generation, Chinese scholars can take English as working language because what? Because we read so much in English and in other language, in Western language. And we actually shaped our own understanding and theoretical reasoning mode through our reading of this text and of all these things. So this is largely what I try to make clear is that this largely, the extremely rapid translation and constant changing translation terms since modern times have, enabled Chinese classical Chinese thought to complete philosophicalization and breaking away from its original context and its life experience context foundations and become our argumentative systems from concept to propositions. Just as you can say, we will say, okay, part of Chinese thought belongs to cosmological views, and part of it belongs to ethics, part of it belongs to ontological constructions. This is totally come from the Western academia and totally come from the Western styles of the structural construction of intellectual world. So what I try to make clear is that the dual translation is a very special case that nowadays we face up as a contemporary Chinese scholar. And the other things is that this dual translation is actually give us a very important question or challenge, how we can understand the modernization of Chinese over the past century also. Because this change actually has deeply reshaped the mindset of the scholarly expression in China nowadays. So this, for me, is another way of translation. Just as Roger mentioned, we try to translate Chinese into Western language, but actually we have the other directions. We try to figure out what was the consequence of the translation from Western language into Chinese and reshaped the whole vocabulary, terminology of Chinese scholarly life or scholarly writing. And thirdly, I want to say that from the thematic to intelligibility, in what sense can we understand and valued in the boundary of translation? Translation can be divided to 3 levels for me. Introduction, generalization, I call it transcoding, and understanding. The introduction of the words classical Chinese thought and its textual carriers can be regarded as the most basic translation work. I call it the most fundamental. And transcoding, which I called 转译, at the level of words, a key concept or key terms can be understood as 格义. Actually, it's just the day before yesterday, I tried to find the English translation of 格义, because for me, this totally do not need any kind of English counterpart of 格义. But it seems that they give me an answer of conceptual matching, which is sound very weird, for me. But 格义 is also trying to, it also includes difference at various levels, such as argumentative strategy, lifestyles, and a mode of expressions, which I call it 经验对齐, which we do not say the lingo or the so-called conceptual, but experiential matching, using the similar scenario in daily life to highlight the difference in way of thinking and the concept between different cultures. I call this 经验对齐, but not the so-called conceptual matching. And the most important part, and as you can learn from the speech given by Roger, is about understanding, 理解. Understanding means placing oneself in both historical and contemporary context, or delving into the context and semantic to comprehend the complexity of each word, and being able to sympathetically understand the origin of the problem or issue consciousness in Chinese thought, as well as the characteristic and boundary of its expression. So to speak, I would say that I try to emphasize from the text to experience, from the analog of abstract concept to the understanding of specific context. How is the untranslatability of classical Chinese text possible, and what is the value of confirming this untranslatability for understanding Chinese and other intellectual tradition? So what I try to make clear is that there is a textual levels of translation, but there is a mutual understanding levels of life experience in the living scenario. And when we explore into the textual context, maybe we should use our common understanding of daily experience to have the similar understanding of the same scenario, and then try to figure out what is different. And this is the proper way for the interpretative translation between different languages and between different cultural traditions. So what I try to make clear is that through this so-called untranslatability is the most potential intellectual consequence in the cross contextual understanding, because it demonstrates the uniqueness in the life experience and the conceptual systems and expression strategy of different cultural traditions. Thereby, through recognition of this difference, we can expanding the possibility of human spiritual life, which I think is the most valuable part of the translation in intercultural and interlingual context. So this largely is part of my own understanding of the work of Professor Roger Ames. I would say that Professor Roger Ames' translation actually balance different dimensions, including academic history, conceptual transcoding, and expression strategy. At the same time, through translation to transfer of the meaning, they make scholars using Chinese, classical or modern, and other languages aware of conceptual consequence brought about by different in-life experience. This mutual understanding is based on respect and sympathy rather than merely translation. Meanwhile, his translations have also become a perspective for native-speaking scholars to understand their own intellectual traditions. At least for me, it's a very insightful and inspiring teaching or lessons for me to have a more in-depth understanding of my own intellectual history and intellectual traditions. So what I try to make is that every translation is a reflection on concepts and their connotations, a presentation of a context and a review of conceptual changes. It can be said that each word is a unique form of intellectual history and a typological presentation of complex textual contexts. For scholars, this quality is not only a reference, but also a starting point for further reflection and explorations. In this sense, as professional scholars, we should be grateful to Professor Roger Ames for his pioneering and painstaking efforts. His work allows us to see a unique form of dedicating oneself to academia and immersing in a cross-cultural context. I use this term, 好之者不如乐之者. Better to be a happy lover than a admirer. So this is part of my, I wish you'd be flattered. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cheng. Professor Ames, you have about 10 minutes to reply if you have something.
Perfect. Le Song Laoshi has made some really important points. Maybe the first point that I would start with is that Aristotle talks about the human being as logos. And that's usually understood, or traditionally has been understood, as the human being is a rational animal. But recently, Gadamer, Charles Taylor, they have said that no, logos doesn't mean rational animal, it means language animal, that we are language animals. And when you think that through, Le Song is really making the point about the centrality of translation is all of these different, carrying over, communicating, and so on, that there is a sense in which we tend to think of a person in terms of their body. And so in English, we say somebody, everybody, we say someone, no one. And so the body becomes an indexical, but in fact, a person is really an extended conversation. That a person is somebody that we have, when you talk about a relationship is a relating to. It's a communication over a long period of time. And to the point where I think I could say, and I think, that in a lifetime, maybe you get to have half a dozen friends, people that you really know. There's all kinds of people that you wish you knew better, that you could spend more time with. But in a lifetime, maybe you're entitled only to half a dozen people that you really get to know as intimate friends. And so this idea of a language animal, that the most important thing that we do is our language. Le Song Laoshi talked about intermediate language. The problem that Lao Wai has in terms of understanding China is this kind of Christianization of China. And so even if you go to the library at Beida and you look for Chinese philosophy, it's shelved under religion, shelved under religion. If you go to a bookstore, a Western bookstore, and you look for Chinese philosophy, I Ching, Lun Yu, Zhuangzi, don't look under Kant, philosophy. You have to go to a shelf that is Dongfeng Zongjiao, Eastern religions. And so this problem is real. The problem is real. But Lao Zhong also has a problem. And that is that at the end of the 19th century, beginning in Japan, at that time, Japan was the go-to place. Everybody was going to Japan because Japan was new knowledge, Western knowledge, and so on. And so over a period of maybe 50 years, Western education was imported wholesale into East Asia, into Japan, China, Korea, Vietnam. And more important, the language of the Western curriculum was translated into the Chinese language. And so Western modernity became part of a Chinese way of framing not only the Western tradition, but their own tradition. And so we teach in Zhexue Xi. Zhexue, that's not Chinese. Sometimes I teach Lunli Xue. Oh, that's ethics. Sometimes I teach Xing'er Sheng. Oh, that's metaphysics. And sometimes Loji, that's not Chinese, And that's not, that's philosophy, but sociology, anthropology, that all of the framework, the conceptual structure, the theoretical, we theorize China according to a Western framework. And so that's a fundamental problem of Lao Zhong. What is really interesting, though, even more interesting, is that when Buddhism came into China, and this is Ge Yi, and then when Buddhism first came in, what they tried to do was they tried to find in the Chinese language terms that would express the Buddhist tradition. And then along came Kumarajiva, and he said, Ge Yi is a bad idea. We have to let the tradition speak on its own terms. And so a new language was developed in Chinese to express Buddhism, just as a new language was developed in Chinese to express Western modernity. But what happened with Buddhism in the Chinese tradition is that Buddhism changed. So if we talk about Songming Li Xue, you have to talk about Buddhism. But China produced its own Buddhism. So when you look at Huayan, when you look at Sanlun, when you look at Chan, this is an Indian Buddhism, this is Chinese Buddhism. Chinese Buddhism that has been refined through the same kind of cosmology that I was talking about, I Ching Da Zhuan, this way of thinking. And so that idea of the intermediate language, I think, is really an important issue. There's one thing that is also very interesting. When I first came to China in 1985, I went to Shanghai Shokeyuan, and there were two young professors. I was very young, but there were two young professors who decided that they were going to translate my book. And so they translated a book that I did called Thinking Through Confucius into Chinese. And the translation is absolutely terrible. It's awful. It's like a third language. It's not Chinese and it's not English, but it's a very curious book to read. But what is really important about that is that was the beginning. But now you go into a Chinese bookstore and everything Western has been translated into Chinese, and the quality of the translation is incredible. The translations are really good. Somebody translated my most recent book, Human Becomings, Cheng Ren Zhi Dao, and I read the Chinese translation and I think this is much better than the English. you know, that China has learned something in this process of translating Western literature. But if you go into a Western bookstore, you don't find the great minds of China. You don't find Xiong Shili. You don't find Liang Shuming. You don't find Mo Zhongshan, and so on. That there's this asymmetry. And this asymmetry is really a deficit on the part of the Western tradition, because we didn't have that experience of learning. I mean, translation is so important. Everything that Lo Song said is so important, that we have somehow or other we speak English. And if you don't understand, then we'll speak louder, you know. There's that kind of an approach to. There's also the difference between the commentarial tradition versus original philosophers. Like when we look at the Western philosophical tradition, you have Plato, and then you have Aristotle. And Aristotle says, I love Plato, my teacher, but I love truth more. And so then he bashes Plato. And then it goes on. The tradition is all about individual original philosophers. But when we look at the Chinese tradition, it's the canons, the canonical texts, and then commentaries and commentaries and commentaries without people saying, I'm an original philosopher. But that is really, that is deceiving. That when you look at the difference between Plato and Aristotle, not so different. Aristotle is very much a Platonist, you know. I mean, it's a sort of a family feud, but these people are basically looking at the world in a very similar way. And so the creativity that is part of the commentarial tradition, we all know Gadamer as the guy who does hermeneutics. But one of Gadamer's recent students is an Italian named Vattimo. And Gianni Vattimo. And Gianni Vattimo says that commentary is not secondary. It's not epiphenomenal. That commentary is integral to a text. That you have a text and you have the commentaries. This is Xiangxiang Lun. This is another way of thinking about how the Chinese tradition, rather than pretending to this kind of absolute originality, in fact, is really understanding the tradition and more of continuing growth as opposed to individual philosophers. And so the idea of commentary is not so different from original philosophy, I don't think.
Thank you, Professor Ames. And now let's turn to Professor Powers.
Yes, I won't be speaking for as long, but I have some, oops, why does this not, this isn't going anywhere. Here? Okay, got it. Okay, so I want to, Roger's talk starts with the observation that different languages have different ways of organizing the world, and I accept that. In fact, I agree with everything Roger said, basically, in the talk. I think he really put his finger on it. But underneath those languages, that is to say, beneath the vocabulary, the grammar, the semantics, there's something deeper, which is the metaphor that informs the substance model, for example. So if you read Plato and Aristotle, the underlying metaphor, they both use metals. It's a substance, right? Different kinds of persons are made of different kinds of substances. Aristocrats are made of gold. Nobility are made of silver. Craftsmen are made of brass, and so on, down to dirt, okay? And you can imagine who those people are. So, and these things never change. So this metaphor, although the languages are different, and although the ways of expressing, say, the value of a person are different, the metaphor, the logic of the metaphor is the same in Chinese and English and German and Japanese. It's the same. So for example, gold can only give rise to gold. right? Iron can only give rise to iron. You can't get gold from iron, right? So the substance model, the metal model, is automatically ranked, okay? And in fact, it's a caste system. It must give rise to a caste system, okay? Where you have hereditary classes, okay? Hereditary castes from top to bottom. This comes right out of the metal metaphor. Aristotle doesn't talk about it at the level of philosophy. He just uses it as a literary ornament, but actually that's what's really going on, okay? And so in a substance metaphor, again, these things get visualized in the arts. And so God, as you can see here, is soul, and this is substance. So soul is higher than body or substance. God is imposing his order onto the world. This is another metaphor that's very fundamental. W.J.T. Michel often points out that a basic metaphor in the European tradition is the tabula rasa. That is a wax tablet which you impress your ideas onto, okay? And that's what God is doing here. He's impressing his mind onto the universe. This way of thinking is very closely linked to aristocratic systems, as you can see, right? Gold, silver, brass, right? Iron, dirt. And so here we see, oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, it goes this way, right. Okay, so Roger points out that Tao is not the way or his way, right, but God's, but rather our way together. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a little bit. But first, let's look more at the substance metaphor as it shows up in the European tradition. But you also have it in China. I would argue that this substance model shows up in medieval China, after the Han and before the Song. You could find statues like this. Not so realistic, but you could find it. So what's happening here is the Pharaoh is impressing his will on that slave's head, okay? Here, Emperor Hadrian is impressing his will on this enemy child's body, because that enemy child is an existential threat, supposedly. Okay. The same with these slaves here. Now, this gave rise to something called honor. When I first saw this statue, I was thinking to myself, what kind of coward would lord it over these people in chains who can't defend themselves, right? That looks like a model of cowardice to me. But in the 18th century, this was considered honor. This was considered great. The average German walked by there and they said, wow, that's my guy, he's good. Okay. Oops, sorry. The same here, actually. There's another, talk about ideas never changing. If you read Hobbes carefully, you see Aristotle all over the place, right? So Aristotle basically says, okay, what's good for the master is good for the slave. Of course, he didn't ask the slave what he thought. He just absorbs the slave's personhood into his own person and makes the slave into nothing. Well, Hobbes does that with the people. Okay, so don't let anybody tell you this is a democratic image. It is not. This is the virtual people, but it's also the real people get absorbed. Hobbes actually says, what's good for the king is good for the people, whether they like it or not. Okay, and so that's again, it's top down. You see, it's a the whole thing isn't showing up here. There's a problem with the sizing. Maybe just move it up a bit. Oh, good. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. So, again, this goes with, Needham took this for granted. He says, thus the mechanical and quantitative, the forced and externally imposed was absent in the Chinese case. Maybe not during the medieval period, but in the classical period. This, by the way, is a mural by Banksy in London on the Justice Building, which now has been totally erased, okay? But it's the same conception of authority, where the guy on top is in total control and the guy on the bottom has no options whatsoever. This is typical of aristocratic, fascist, fundamentalist systems. Now, all these images visually express the idea of a zero-sum intergroup relationship, which again comes out of the substance model, with the subordinate member being totally subject to the dominant member's whims. So here, for example, this is Samson, and this is a Philistine, all right? So Samson, notice he's not killing the Philistine, he's thinking about it. Should I do it or not, right? And so he's totally in control. The Philistine is completely at the mercy of his whim. And this is precisely how Montesquieu describes the concept of honor, which according to him was the very source of an aristocrat's authority. This was true in Greece also. To this whimsical honor is owing that the virtues are only just when it pleases and as it pleases. It extends or limits our duties, our meaning aristocrats, duties according to its own fancy. And there's a reason why it does that. Basically, he's saying that we aristocrats have arbitrary authority. And why? Because honor is naturally subject to whims, by which the subject's obedience will be always directed, right? Because he can do whatever he wants to you, right? And therefore you're going to be obedient. That's Western democracy right there. In fact, Montesquieu, when he gets around to democracy, he says the best democracies start out by dividing the population into ranked castes, okay? That's not what we call democracy, okay? But anyway, so that's the substance model. Now, Roger comes up with a different metaphor, okay? The zoetological one, which I think is kind of organic, right? And he says reproduction for human beings when located within a kinship lineage or family tree is not so much at variance with plant growth. Again, I agree completely. And this is a good metaphor. What Roger does with much of his exegesis is he gives us new metaphors, new visual images for accessing these concepts. And I think that's absolutely necessary to get past the Christianization. You have to find the Christian metaphor and throw it out and replace it. But it's a good metaphor. But structurally speaking, plant growth is dendritic, just like clouds. And this is what how Guoxiang puts the matter. I'll read it in English, but you can read the Chinese. This is my translation. This is Guoxiang's commentary, of course, on Zhuangzi's parable of the shadow and the penumbra, right? Returning to the image of the penumbra being dependent on the shadow, in reality, the two arise together, as we see in collections of clouds, where neither depends on the other. And here he's different from Needham, right? Because the whole organism, it's not that everything's dependent on the organism. Everything arises, as you see. All things arise together, all one by one contributing to the formation of the natural system, such that there are none who do not arise independently of the others. So everyone is an independent organism and yet contributes to the whole. And this is something Roger explains very nicely in his books. But we see it, here's your metaphor right here. Okay, if you look at the clouds, some are bright and some are dark, right? Which one shapes the other? Okay, they shape each other. The darker ones are made of cooler air, okay, and the molecules are not moving as rapidly. The lighter ones are denser because you have more, they're being heated up by the sun, the molecules are moving more rapidly. So you might think, oh, the forceful ones are shaping the cooler ones, but no, the cooler ones have friction, right? So as the heated air tries to move into the cooler air, it meets with friction, it meets with resistance, and that brings about the shape. So they shape one another according to internal principles. And this is the same, these represent the fluid qi, and you can see again, the black is a figure and the red is also a figure. There's no figure ground separation. Whenever you have a figure ground separation, it's very much like you've got God. God is the ground, and you're the figure, and God determines what your shape is, okay? But here, all the shapes, each shape determines the other shape, right? They're mutually shaping. And this was the Chinese metaphor, the graphic, what I have called the graphic paradigm for natural process. And it seems to me, and Roger may disagree, that Guoxiang's conception here is quite similar to Confucius' notion here, right? 夫仁者己欲立而立人, right? 己欲达而达人, right? It's not identical, but again, it's mutual formation. And of course, you see this in Chinese landscapes where, again, the clouds in the landscape shape one another. Not all landscapes, but a number of them work in those that take as their subject natural process, okay? 天地, from sometimes on means natural process. Those landscapes show this graphically. Now, there were Europeans in the 17th century who basically understood that the Chinese philosophy was monist. So here I'm quoting Jonathan Israel, one of the leading interpreters of the Enlightenment. Confucianism for Bayle, like Malebranche, possessed a purely rational structure. Why rational? Because there's no God, okay? A purely rational structure grounded in nature rather than any transcendental realm. 没有形而上, right? One identifying nature as the totality of what is an exclusive source of its own laws and principles. This comes very close to Guoxiang's commentary on Qi Wu Lun, okay? So these guys kind of got it, especially Bayle. And Israel actually argues that this was, in his mind, this is the core insight of the Enlightenment, that modern governance could not have evolved as long as God was part of government. And it was only when Europeans began to entertain the idea of a secular moral system, which was closely linked with Confucius. So Confucius and Spinoza were both linked together in the 17th century already. Christian Wolff reads the 大学 in translation in 1721 and decides, oh, this is what we Europeans need. And of course, Kant was his student. But I should tell you parenthetically that when Wolff, in his inaugural speech at Halle University, said, hey, I got this great idea. You know, we Europeans have been killing each other for centuries. What we need is a secular moral system like the Chinese have. They told him to leave town in 24 hours or be hanged. Okay. But anyway, he escaped, he left, as you might imagine. So here again, Roger's discussion of Ren, right? And again, I accept it totally. The distinction between benefactor and beneficiary is something that you do not get in not only in Confucian thought, but I think even in Taoist thought. The need to put yourself in the place of the other. All this is a notion that again got picked up by none other that appears in visual form in China quite early. So this Hobbes image is considered one of the first attempts to visualize the polity in the West. In China, we have it very early. This is one of the earliest attempts. And in Han China, of course, court and state maintained separate budgets and administrations with the people's taxes going to the state. They didn't go to the emperor. This was true also of Song Ming Qing China. All right, the emperor could not touch the people's taxes. That had to be used for the people. The metaphorical beast of state, in this case, was conceived as a two-headed prodigy, with one head referring to the government and the other to the people. We don't know which one because they're the same size, same height, both cooperating to bring about a good society. But what we do know from inscriptions here is that you have the government is one of the heads, and the other head is the people, but especially the most vulnerable people. Why? Because in Mencius, the way a government treats the most vulnerable people is a litmus test for how good the government is. If it's 仁政, right? If it's 仁政, then the government will take care of the vulnerable people. If it doesn't, it's not 仁 and it's not legitimate. So this is a legitimate government here, and we see it that way. Also remember that the officials in Han times were recruited from among the people. So there's no ontological difference between the officials and the ordinary taxpayers. In fact, we have many examples of ordinary taxpayers working their way up into the system. Such a holistic relational ethics is reflective, requiring deference to both the specific needs of others and concern for one's own interest. This is, of course, very different from a zero-sum Linke type of logic, and it's absolutely essential for modern interstate relations. Not that it's actually implemented very often, but it is essential. And we could trace that back to Ben Franklin, who had been reading Confucius. Okay, so Ben Franklin printed large sections of the Morals of Confucius in his Pennsylvania Gazette, including this one. I think it comes from The Great Learning. If we condemn and mortally hate a person by reason of certain defects and render not justice to his good and excellent qualities, it cannot be said that our mind is in a state where it ought to be. We can all think of those passages. In Tom Jefferson's eyes, Franklin, as ambassador to France, was the embodiment of this ideal. His temper was so amiable and conciliatory, his conduct so rational, that reasonable disposition, sensible that advantages are not all to be on one side, yielding what is just and liberal. That's what the word liberal originally meant, not like neoliberal liberal. So I should point out here, actually, that although it's definitely true that philosophical terms like ethics and ontology are all borrowed from the West, in the 18th century, the West went through this process already, borrowing extensively from Chinese translations. My book, Xi Zhong You Dong, will give you all the details, but many of our most what we think of as core Western concepts like equality, the people, and so on, these are coming from China. They're not coming from an aristocratic. You won't find it in Aristotle's Politics. And another footnote I'll put here is that if you read especially 17th century political theory in Europe, it's just Aristotle. Over and over and over. In fact, right up to 1776, the Parliament of Paris, basically Turgot had been reading the Chinese sources, and he's pushing meritocracy. And he gets kicked out of his job, and the Parliament of Paris, just to underscore this, says, look, some of us are born to rule and some are born to be ruled, and just shut up, so that's basically what they did to that. And that's Aristotle, right? That's like page 1 of Politics, okay? So in any case, this whole notion of not zero-sum, but win-win can be traced back to Jefferson and Franklin and those guys. Of course, it's no longer part of our tradition. As a final comment, I would add that this group of philosophers were publishing during the first Cold War era, yet did not engage in the party line of that period because the mainstream view was zero-sum, top-down, very much like an aristocratic view, with interstate relations understood in ontological terms. That is, there's no way we can communicate with those people because they're authoritarian and we're democratic, even if we don't act that way. So instead these guys here, this, by the way, is Don Monroe, my colleague at University of Michigan for several decades, and that handsome young man there is Roger. Instead, they sought to understand Chinese philosophy on its own terms, terms that foster win-win interstate relations. True, this approach was far from mainstream at the time, but better late than never. Okay. Oops.
Thank you very much, Professor Powers. And Professor Ames, you have about 10 minutes if you have
Okay. It's always very unfair for somebody who does philosophy to have to compete with somebody who does art. Art is so much more interesting than philosophy. But Marty talked about images. There is a very, unfortunately, 2 years ago at Beijing, we lost one of our best philosophers, a man named Zhang Shenglong. And Shenglong wrote a paper that is really central. If you write to me, my email address is on the first slide. I'll send you a copy of this paper. It's called 生思维与概念思维. And Marty talking about 概念思维 was really talking about human beings, and then about how slaves, not only slaves but women, don't have the same ontological value as men. Women are somehow broken persons. They're not fully a human being. And so that kind of categorical thinking is really the basis of a lot of racism and the idea of separating things in an absolute way. That's not helpful. That's not when you think 一多不分, everything is moving into each other. 道可道非常道. That the Le Song talked about in the Chinese tradition, the fundamental worry about limitations. That language tends to close things off, and when you close things off, what you do is you create problems. And that problem is really 概念思维, is categorical kind of thinking. And so that's one point that I wanted to make coming off of Marty. Another one is I tell my students, Fei Xiaotong. Fei Xiaotong was one of my heroes. And people called him a sociologist. He was a philosopher, And Fei Xiaotong became very famous because he had a metaphor. He talked about, this cha shu ge ju and 20 ge ju, and the idea of throwing a stone into the water and then you watch the ripples as they come out. And so we can understand human beings in terms of relationality. And I thought that is a very useful metaphor, but I wanted to be famous too, like Fei Xiaotong. And so I thought of my own metaphor. And so my own metaphor, like when you think of Fei Xiaotong's metaphor, it's 向外, like it's centrifugal, but not centripetal. But when you think of relationality in Confucian cosmology, it's always collateral. It's always 双性的. It's never 单性的. And so what you need is 相信. And so my metaphor for 相信 is the idea of 念论 in trees. That if you cut a tree and you look at the rings, we call them annual rings, they tell you the story of the tree. It's the narrative. Like what a tree is always doing is internalizing what is external. Like a tree brings the environment into itself. If you read a tree, you can tell the story of the environment within which the tree grew. And so the idea of the tree is also, we talk about roots and branches. And so our way of thinking, an ontological way of thinking, is first you have the root and then you have the tree. That's not true. My father was an apple farmer. And the root and the tree come together or not at all. The roots are branches underground. The branches are roots reaching to the sky. And there's no boundary on it. Like the sun and the air and everything comes, and the leaves of the tree grow the tree just like the roots grow the tree. And so the tree has to be understood in terms of the holistic, the tree and the branches, 本末是分不开的, that it's one holistic organism. I hoped that when I showed you the picture, that was my attempt to be Zhang Shanglong. It was my attempt to say, maybe an image to talk, like I talked about Tao as this kind of world growing ecology. And that's very conceptual, that's very philosophical, but it doesn't really communicate in the way that I think the idea of how each one of us, belongs to a community of people where we grow and we make our contribution to the world in our relationships with these other people, that's an ecology, and then we pass it on. When our hair turns white, then we pass it on to our students. So that was the second thing. And then the final thing that I wanted to say to just emphasize a point that Marty also brought up, and that is this notion of a different kind of causality. When we think of Aristotle, you have the four causes, 四因, the four causes, the efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, final cause. But when you think of 自然 causality, 然 is adverbial. If you say 安然, if you say 必然, if you say 显然, obviously, that the ran is modal. It tells you about the modality of something. And so when you talk about 自然, what is the 自? We know 自 is the 必字, but the 自 is that each particular is unique. That when you begin from relationality, one of the mistakes, like when we talk about the Confucian tradition, we don't want to talk about individualism, but we want to talk about individuality. 独特性, they 和而不同, that it's all about becoming an individual. 当然不让有失, that when it becomes to becoming 人, you don't yield even to your teacher. That you have to become your ren. You can't become somebody else's ren. Each ren is different, And so that's really important. So the 字 is the uniqueness of each person. It's also the existential. That when we look at ren, 这个概念, we always think of ren has to do with 关系, but it also has to do with ontogenesis of yourself. It's the process of becoming a person. That to become a person, you have to become self-conscious. You have to create another person that you can talk to. You have to talk to yourself. And that doesn't start, like when you are first born, you don't have this other person that you can talk to. And so the intersubjectivity is primary. And then we generate a self, but we generate a self-consciousness, a self-awareness that we can evaluate. We can say, I shouldn't have done that. Or, I feel ashamed because other people are looking at me. That this idea of creating a second self is really important. And so another important aspect of the 自 in 自然 is existential. It's the vital self. The third aspect is a recognition that whoever you are, that you're a focus in a field, that there's no boundary on a person. We see a body and we think the body has a certain shape and so on, but the inside and the outside are continuous. And relationality, some relationships are more immediate, some relationships are very distant, but all relationships are part of every moment of your life. And so the question is, what are you doing with those relationships? Are you cultivating those relationships? Are those relationships productive? Are they robust? Are they elegant? Are they gracious? And so the notion of 自然, is a recognition that everything is the cause of anything. And that any one thing is the cause of everything else. That everything is, that each thing is part of everything else. That I'm a condition of your life. You're a condition of my life. And that is true of all of the things in the world. So what it does is it teaches us the virtue of recognizing our interdependence with everything else. So I will stop there, Jess.
Thank you, Professor Ames, for your elaboration. And Professor Cheng and Professor Powers.
Yeah.
You go first.
Comments, yeah. I think we have about.
Maybe you just start right away for the Q&A section,
Yeah,
because we are just out of times. So yeah, actually just 1 hour ago I was asked to be the moderator of the Q&A sections, so which did make me very nervous. Because I must take the privilege of the moderator of the Q&A section to make clear about the rules of this section. Any questions is welcome, but actually I would ask every one of you to do me a favor to put your question in very brief way. I think 1 sentence for your self-introduction and another several sentence for your questions. No comments at all. And know your own speech for any issues that matter related to the speech. And the third rule is never raise any question to me, because I have no idea what I have said. So I guess that maybe we can limit ours for saving time. So we just open to 3 questions, and which one go first? Okay. Oh, so many of them. Yeah, you lady go first. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good evening, professors. And I have a question for Professor Ames. I'm from Renmin University in China, and I'm a postgraduate graduate student. And this semester, I have a class from Professor Wen Haiming, who is your student.
2 minutes sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Professor Wen Haiming says you translate 君子 into the notion of exampling person. So my question is why you use that translation of exampling person, and is there some similarities with this notion with the best man in the Greek ethics or virtue ethics?
The last word, the Greek ethics, what term?
The best man.
Best man.
Best
Best
man.
man from Aristotle or Plato, I suppose.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you for your question. And Renmin Daxue. I think the word exemplary, like when you think of Renjia, Junzi, Shengren, then you have to ask, how are they different? Renjia seems to be focused on person-to-person relationality. And so we want to think in terms, so for Renjia, I translate it as consummate person. Con means together, summa means as good as you can be. And so Ren is an attempt in your relationship with other people to find the best person that we can be the best. With Junzi, originally Junzi is a political idea. It's a ruler, it's an aristocrat. But what we find with Confucius is Confucius says, let's not talk about nobility of blood, let's talk about nobility of character, nobility of, and so exemplary really is a social, political idea. And so somebody who is a Junzi is not only an achieved person, is not only a person who has cultivated themselves, but is somebody who is an example to other people in the society as the kind of person that they should be. And so I translate exemplary as that. But just to make one point, in preparing my source book, my goal for teaching Western students Chinese philosophy is not to, like the old translation of Junzi is gentleman. Do you want to be a gentleman? No, you want to be a gentlewoman. The gentleman is 性别歧视, you know, and so the idea of gentleman is noble, and so that has some virtue to it, but exemplary person is a better idea. But in preparing my own work, my goal is that Western students, a serious student of Chinese philosophy, has to say Dao is Dao, Ren is Ren, Junzi is Junzi, and they have to learn the Chinese terms. I teach Greek philosophy. I don't do classical Greek language, but I know 30, 40 different terms that are the key philosophical vocabulary of the Greek language, and I understand them with some sophistication. That's where the serious student of Chinese philosophy has to be. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Oh, yes. Hey, Roger. I'd like to ask a quite small question. Where can I find the argument you mentioned in your PowerPoint? What zoological thinking aids to correlative or analogical thinking is that it quite literally brings this cosmology to life. I focus on symbiosis research. This is a big question. Our common understanding of symbiosis is purely biological, but the concept has changed to include the non-biological means. However, most people still analogize a human social society, even talk symbiosis between humans and machines. But biological explanation alone is insufficient, which is not a true philosophical foundation. We need Chinese philosophy and Eastern philosophy to provide a theoretical basis. And I find this argument
I think it's too long.
really important. So where should I start? This is my question.
And it's a very good question. I think the first point is that the whole idea of Sheng Sheng Lun, the zoetology, I just created the term, but it's Chinese scholars. My colleague Zhang Kai at Beijing, he worries. He says, Tang Yongtong and Mo Zhongshan and even Chen Lai, they keep on using the word Bunti Lun all the time, and Bunti Lun just makes everything confusing because it confuses the Greeks and the Chinese. He says, let's not use that term. Let's not use it and then try to qualify it. Let's abandon it. And then Jiao Tingyang, Jiang Shenglong, Sun Xiangchen, all of these Chinese philosophers are saying it's all about Sheng Sheng. And so I created the English word zoetology. And what zoetology begins from is the idea of life. And so your point, and I think it's a very important point, and that is that in your world today, for young people, the whole idea of artificial intelligence has really become a central issue. But my argument would be that let's stop calling it AI. From a Chinese perspective, let's call it NI, natural, 自然智能. That technologies have always been part of what human beings do, and we do it really well. And as long as we can align our technologies with our best practices, our best values, then those technologies are wonderful. So if the technologies can take care of old people, great. If technologies can take care of young people, great. If they can help us with hospitals, if they can help us with education, then all of those technologies are a wonderful thing. It's when technologies become bombs. It's when technologies become destructive and hurtful and wander away from our best values that they become pernicious. And so, I think the term zoetology is catching on. And I created that term, so I can be famous too.
So actually, I think that maybe we have time for 2 questions, maybe. And if any one of you have questions for Professor Powers? No one? Both of them? Okay, that's great.
put it in a very brief way.
Okay. Roger, you mentioned in your presentation that the Tao is often recognized or understood as the source of all things, but it also emphasized from time to time that Tao is not the creator, and which is also stressed by Martin. So I'm wondering, how can the idea of Tao being the source of all things reconciled with the idea of Tao not being a creator? Or to put it simply, how can a thing or object which is recognized as the source of all things cannot be properly denominated as the creator? Because we also have in ancient Zhuangzi's text the phrase 造物者, which is the literal translation of the creator, right? Okay, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Very nice. And I agree. My father, I said, was an apple farmer. And so he had a farm and it grew apples. He didn't look at the land as the creator. For him, the land was his farm and the apple trees grew. And so he didn't see, like, if you think about it, then the idea of generation, the idea of growth, it all comes out of the soil and the whole system. The soil isn't one thing. The soil is enriched by the sun. The soil is enriched by compost and by other elements. And so at the end of the day, when you ask the question, what grew the apples, you have to say everything grew the apples. The sun and the air and the ground and everything grew the apples. And so do we say that everything is the creator, or is everything is the source? Yes, and we call that everything Tao.
Yeah, again, this question is raised both in the Zhuangzi and in Guoxiang's commentary, right? And especially in the parable of the shadow. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because it really sounds like, well, if the shadow moves, the penumbra moves. And the shadow moves because the body moves. And then the body must move because something higher moves. And this creates a hierarchy. Guoxiang points that out, that if you accept that, then you end up with Aristotle's prime mover, right? But in the end, Guoxiang said, no, that's not actually what happens. Zhuangzi compares it, and here I think Brooke Zipperan's interpretation is very good. Zhuangzi compares it to a snake and its skin. Before the snake sheds its skin, they're inseparable, right? But at some point, then they become separable. So again, Guoxiang emphasizes that it's like a cloud. So you have to think of a different metaphor, okay? So when you put it in English, you start out with the ontological metaphor, right? The source of all things has to be a thing, right? And so you've got a substance metaphor there. So Guoxiang says, no. And actually Zhuangzi too is basically adopting a cloud metaphor where the clouds give rise to one another. And there's no way you could say that these clouds cause those clouds. They arise all together, and yet each nodule is individual and has its own attitude and its own point of view. And here again, I want to repeat something I said to Roger earlier, that it's a Beijing begins a zouyi, that is a policy document on law, by quoting the Zuozhuan. And it says, 一人一心, 万人万心, okay? So, if one person, one point of view, 1,000 persons, 1,000 point of views, this means that the individuality of the person resides more in their point of view, their perspective, which by definition is unique, right? Because we're all spatially oriented in the world. No one has the same perspective as you have. And so everyone's perspective is completely unique, even though we fashion one another in ways that Roger has explained. And here again, the last thing I'll say is I'll underscore that Guoxiang and Zhuangzi, I think, are different from Needham. Needham keeps using the word dependent. Everyone is dependent on this world system. Guoxiang insists, no, everyone is independent. And together, and together they all make up the system. And so it works like that.
Yes, since you mentioned about Zhuangzi, about 造物者, I want to add several words about it. For me, to read into Zhuangzi, the most important thing is you just cannot read it words by words. 造物者, 上与造物者游, which means I think that's the emphasis of this sentence is to emphasize the situation of the path, the limitation of you yourself. To get another living situations which is totally different from the daily one. 或上与造物者有, and he says 生者不生. If you just translate it in very literal way, the things that give birth to everything do not have its own birth. This I think is a totally misleading understanding of 生者. And the other things that I want to emphasize is that in traditional Chinese texts, there is always a very strange or very special expression strategy of parallel or bi-directional expressions. Say when we say 人同此心, we must say in the same time 人而有间. There is different among peoples, but the other things there is similarity in the mindset among peoples. The similarity and the differences must be treated in the same time. We just cannot go just one direction. We must treat it in bi-directional, and then this might be the comprehensive understanding of the terms. I think this is largely very Chinese style and Chinese characteristic of reasoning and expressions of special ideas. Yeah, and I guess last questions. Yeah, there. Goes to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roger, and I'm glad to hear that you translate 生生论 use the word zoetological because my name is Zoe, so I'm very happy. And my question is about zoetological. Why do you choose the word Zoe to translate 生生? Because we can just translate 生生 in production, procreativity, or something just have the thing you all mentioned about 生生, because it's a traditional way we translate 生生 which is just the meaning of 生生. And so have you used the word zoetological to translate 生生? You have already had a concept to compare it with Western ontological or Greek philosophy, because Zoe has the word has a Greek origin, so it mean life, body in Greek. So I don't know. It is ad hoc to use this word, and it means that we have to understand it with a comparison to Western. And my follow-up question is: this word is just this concept is just in ontological way, or it's also have a meaning in cosmological, because you have compared it with Western ontology and cosmology. So I don't know if it is in the both sense. Thank you.
Very nice. Very good. A couple of things. First, one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to say ontological thinking is Western thinking, zoetological thinking is Chinese thinking. Bad. That when we look at the Western tradition, we have people like Vico, we have people like Spinoza, we have people like Emerson, we have the transcendental poets. We have the Milesians, Anaximander, Thales, and so on, the early Greek philosophers before Parmenides, who themselves were hylo-zoistic thinkers. Hylo, zoism, hylo is material, zoe is life. These were people who saw the world as being alive, a combination of material and consciousness. And so zoetological thinking, when Nietzsche says God is dead, What Nietzsche is saying is he's saying ontology is dead. Ontological thinking is dead. The idea that the idea that there's something permanent and unchanging in the human experience is a bad idea. Let's get rid of it. From that time in the Western tradition, when we think of hermeneutics, phenomenology, existentialism, pragmatism, post-structuralism, that all of the movements in Western philosophy, process philosophy, Whitehead, Berggruen, they're all trying to think process. They're trying to get away from ontology and trying to think in terms of change. And so the Western philosophical tradition from the end of the 19th century down to today is really an attempt to be zoetological, but the problem is that ontological thinking is so deeply sedimented into the language that the language doesn't want to speak zoetology. And so Heidegger has to create a funny language, and Whitehead, actual occasions and all of this kind of, stuff. You have to find a language that will say what the language doesn't want to say. And so my point is, like in Greek, you could use zoe or you could use bios. These are two ways of saying life, but zoe is the big word. It is life in the broadest sense. Bios tends to be particular. And so I chose the word zoetology, and I think it works. It's catching on.
So maybe we could close here, and please join me to thank Professor Ames and Project Powers for the insightful, and including me, for speech and comments. Thank you.